Alright, we're going to talk about the pan set of watercolor now. The first thing I want to talk about is how to use these because it can be kind of tricky. You're going to start with adding water. If you don't add water and you have a dry brush and you dip into it, absolutely nothing is going to happen. So we need to add water. We're going to start by adding just a little bit of water into each one. All the ones that we want to use. We want to try to use clean water. You can see that wasn't perfectly clean. It would be better if I had started with the yellow. As the water kind of sits in there for a little bit, it's starting to get pigment. So I'm going to talk to you about saturation. If we have more water than pigment, then it's going to come out really light in color. But if I swirl around in here a lot and I pick up more of the paint and I have less water and more paint, then I can get higher saturation. You'll notice that as it runs out, some of my saturation goes away as well. So I can redip if I need more. Let's try that with a darker color. So I'm going to clean out my brush. I'm going to go into this green, and I'm starting with a lot of water, and it's fairly light, and I'm going to swirl around, and now I can paint on it, and we've got more saturation, so I get a darker color. I can blend these together and kind of make an in-between. There are other ways to use these paints as well. So when we're working, I'm going to show you guys a couple of different techniques. The first is going to be a wet on wet. For a wet on wet, I'm just going to start by putting down clean water right down onto the page. I want it to be really wet, like kind of a decent puddle. Then I'm going to select one of the colors that I like, and I can get a high saturation, swirling it around a lot, and sort of dip into it, and you can see that the pigment will spread around and create these really cool patterns. If I was just on dry paper, then the paint is really going to just stay where I put it. But if I put it onto wet, it does really cool things. With the wet on wet, you can switch your colors as well. So if I wanted to do something like a blue to mix with my green, you can see each color will react a little bit differently, but it'll start to kind of mix, it'll push the other colors around, and it does these really fun things. If you have a lot of water like this puddle right here, in the end, you're going to get something called a bloom. Some people don't like blooms. I love them. So I'm going to rinse off my brush and switch to another color to show you a flat wash. So the flat wash, I'm going to try to keep all of my pigment even. So I'm going to start out by painting all the way across this box in one direction, and then I'm going to go again in the other direction. I can add more pigment if I want to, but I need to do this fairly quickly so that I don't get high saturation on one side and low saturation on the other side. I can see I keep getting this sort of dot right here. I'm thinking that I might have a little bit too much water. I like to keep a little bit of like a piece of towel next to me so I can dab up if there seems to be like an extra drip, and then I can paint over that again. There are several ways to do a flat wash, and this is just the technique that I use that I think is the best for my style of painting, but you might explore other options as well. A gradient wash also has lots of different ways to create it, but we're going to use the same color just so that we can contrast it. So with a gradient wash, we're going to try to get dark pigment on one side and light pigment on the other. So high saturation to low saturation. So I'm going to use the same color. What I've done is just a flat wash with a light saturation, and I'm going to add my high saturation onto one side, and I'm just going to kind of pull it around. I'm going to clean off my brush so that I can just use water now to pull that pigment around. Again, I have a little bit of a drip in this corner, so I'm just going to take my towel and soak up that extra water right there. So you can see how now it's fading from high saturation to low. Masking is really fun. So with masking, there's a couple of different options. There is a thing called masking fluid. We don't have it here in the classroom, so I'm not going to show you that today, but that's kind of like a liquid glue sort of thing. you could probably use Elmer's glue to draw with and let it dry. The trick with masking fluid or something like Elmer's glue is that it has to be able to peel away later. So if you want to try the glue, you're welcome to. I don't know, I've never tried it. What I've done is prepared some tape. So I just took a piece of masking tape and I cut a little design in it. And so I'm going to stick that down like that. I want to make sure that all of my edges are really nicely flat onto the paper so that no paint is going to seep in underneath that tape. I can also use masking with wax crayons. Note that these are not the same as our water-soluble crayons that we used in our earlier part of this demonstration. With these, because they are pure wax, the wax is going to repel the water. I need to color really strong with that because if I don't color very strong, not enough wax is going to get on there. So I'll do a demonstration with the orange, where you can see if I color just lightly versus if I color a really strong section where there's no more paper showing through that crayon. High saturation. So then when I do this, I'm going to start with just like a flat wash over this. We'll do red. So if I just paint some red over, you can see that the paint and water are being repelled from the wax crayon here. They're not really being repelled from this wax crayon here, but it's working pretty well down here as well. Might get some higher saturation. Maybe I'll even do a little bit of wet on wet here. That's kind of my favorite technique. I can drip in some other color. I'm going to add some purple. So with wet on wet, you can actually add it in to a wet flat wash as well. And this is less dramatic because I had a little less water, and also because each color reacts a little bit different. All right, over here you can see I have already prepared for my glazing by doing a little section of paint earlier. This section is already dry, so it's no longer wet. Watercolor dries fairly quickly, but it's not always super fast, so you just want to make sure you touch it. If you touch it and it still feels cold, even if it looks dry, it might still be wet, so let it dry a little longer. If it's still shiny, like this here, then it's definitely still wet. So with the glazing, I'm going to show you how watercolor paints are translucent. So we're going to start out by painting something and letting it dry, and then we're going to paint something over it. I'm going to use yellow to paint over it. When we're glazing, you can see that if I paint over this, the colors mix in the middle, and you can see it starting to turn green here. Because yellow is a fairly weak color, it is also pulling some of that blue pigment into the yellow, and so the yellow is getting a little bit green as well. But because watercolor is translucent, or some people call it transparent, but it's not totally clear, you can see what is behind it. Even if I use a darker color, so let's say let's use a purple, it's pretty dark, and I wash over that, I can still see that blue left behind. All right. Let's talk a little bit about splatter painting, and then we'll end this section of the video. Splatter painting is really fun, and this is where our toothbrush is going to come in handy. So the toothbrush does not hold as much water, and the bristles are really stiff. So that's why this is good for splatter, but not really good for painting. To make this work, I need to start with a puddle. So I'm going to go into my palette over here, and I'm going to create a little puddle that I can dip into, and I'm going to add some paint to it as well. I want this to be pretty high saturation. It doesn't have to be super high. Sometimes I keep a piece of scrap paper around that I can test my saturation to see if it's good. So I'm feeling satisfied with that. If I wanted to change this color a little bit, I could rinse off my brush and find some other color to mix into it, and that's going to change the color. So you can mix the colors when you're watercolor painting, just like you would with another kind of paint. Alright, so now I have this. I am going to get my toothbrush wet, and then I'm going to sort of squish it in to this puddle. I would not do this directly into the paint, just because I'm going to scoop up too much paint, and the paint is getting soft here, and I don't want to take away a big chunk of it. So then I'm going to flick with my finger and pointing it down, and I can splatter it like that. One of the things that I think is really fun too is if you actually blow on it after that. So I'm going to add a little bit more, and I go, and it can kind of look like fireworks or something. So there's different techniques. I also think it's really fun to take the opposite end of a paintbrush, so not the bristles, but this side, and you can drag the little puddles across, and it looks like maybe like roots on a tree or octopus tentacles or something like that. Splatter is kind of messy. You can see I got it on some of my other sections, so when you're doing this, make sure you're not doing it near a friend so that you don't end up getting splatter painting on their artwork. That's where I'm going to end this video, and then we'll see you in part 2 for salt, dry brush, sponge stamping, sponge dragging, stretching, and cling wrap.